I won't talk any longer. Francis Moore Lappe, everyone.
What a great joy and excitement I have in being here with you this morning. Thank you so much. Thank you, Trent, Eric, Annabelle, Phil, Paul, Rebecca, everybody who has made all of this happen. I'll never forget the moment early this year, my new book, Getting a Grip. I want to get a grip. It hit, I was on the first day of my tour, and suddenly the coffee party hit the national news. And at the end of my book, I said, I want to be part of a real movement for real democracy. And then it was like, oh my God, it's happening. So it gave me a lot of power, and your example is what I'm learning from. So I love being part of this. So here goes. I want to start with a question that I feel I've got to answer. Because how do I know what to do unless I have an answer to this question? It's really square one. Why are we together creating a world that not one of us as individuals would ever choose? Because nobody gets up in the morning and says, yes, I want to make sure another child dies of hunger. Yes, I want to heat the planet today. What can I do? So, how do we answer that? Well, with only slightly tongue-in-cheek, maybe it's a big misunderstanding. Maybe we human beings have misunderstood our own nature. And I'll leave my picture of my youngest granddaughter up there for a second. This was accidental because we needed to have something up there. But, what's her nature? My little Buddha baby. Okay, maybe we've misunderstood our own nature and the nature of nature itself. And that's why we feel so powerless. And it's what we really need to worry about, our feeling of powerlessness. In fact, maybe it's the only thing we really need to worry about. How can I say that? Well, I think, and believe me, this is a hypothesis. I loved it earlier when Phil and others were talking about not going forth with the truth, but this is my working hypothesis I want to test out with you today. That is that, in fact, solutions to all of our major problems are known, or we're right at the brink of solving them. That take food, which has been the focus of my life. I now realize that since I wrote Diet for a Small Planet, there's actually 1/5 more food available for each human being on Earth than there was in 1971 when Diet for a Small Planet came out. And yet, we have 1 billion people, many more people, going hungry. But even there, we know what to do. Do you know Brazil, which we don't think of as particularly a leader in this regard, that child death, infant death, is a great measure of hunger. And in somewhat over a decade, Brazil has cut its infant death rate by 50%. So there's some measure there. And poverty, yeah, we can do that. In one decade, the 1960s, in the US, we cut the poverty rate in half. And what about the energy, climate change crisis? We're running out. Wait, we're running out? The sun provides us each day 15,000 times the dose of energy that we're currently using, mainly in fossil fuels. And it seems like every day there are breakthroughs in understanding how to take advantage of that sun energy. So, if solutions are right in front of our noses, so to speak, then the real crisis is the feeling of powerlessness that we can have to manifest what is known or what is easily available. So the next question, what is it that robs us of power? And my theory is that what robs us of power is that we human beings uniquely are creatures of the mind. We see the world, earlier the term social bias was used, but all of us see the world through a lens, through a mental map that literally determines what we can see and what we cannot see. That we end up seeing what we're looking for, what we expect to see. This is the challenge of being human. And it came to me in a very homey way last Thanksgiving when I was determined to make my favorite root vegetable dish that morning. And I had needed my favorite pot. It's red, actually. I was looking for this pot I was going to cook my vegetables in. And I couldn't find it anywhere. I went to the basement, all the cupboards, nothing. So I gave up and went on to something else. And an hour later, I turned around. And there it was. Except I had put a plant in it. I hope you see where this is going. I had turned this pot into a plant holder. So, of course, I couldn't see it, even though it's red, and it was literally feet from me as I was cooking. So it was just a reminder that we see what we expect to see, and so here is the challenge. So we have to ask, if we want to know why we're creating a world that we as individuals would never choose, then maybe we need to ask, what is the mental map that is robbing us of power? And so here's my hypothesis, that we absorb like invisible ether a presumption of lack, of scarcity. I call it the scarcity of goods and goodness. We believe there's not enough stuff like energy, for example, or in Boston, it's parking places. But, there's not enough food, energy, love, whatever. So there's also not enough goodness in us, because if you reduce ourselves to what we can really count on, then we are selfish, competitive, and materialistic. So I'm suggesting that the premise of lack puts us in a spiral of powerlessness, because believing this about ourselves, this caricature of our complexity, that of course we don't believe that we can come together and actually enter in dialogue to choose a future that is good for all of us. And we therefore distrust government. And we feel we have no choice but to turn over our fate to some magical force. Ronald Reagan called it the magic of the market. Magical market that responds to the one thing that we can count on. If we start with the premise of lack of goodness, the only thing we really count on is selfishness. And in a market, driven by selfishness, yes, we've got it fixed. We've got it done. Now, while markets have served humanity for eons and eons of time, we have hit upon this peculiar idea, this idea that a market can work if it's driven by one rule, highest return to those who have wealth. And so we end up with what Citigroup has given me a very useful name for it. We end up with what we call plutonomy. And in this plutonomy, just looking at stocks, for example, I just learned yesterday that the top 10% of Americans own more than 90% of the stocks. So we end up then in such concentrated power that it can bend and influence political decision-making. Now, we've been warned by many people about this, and we should have learned maybe playing Monopoly about how this happens, because at least in my house, by the end of the night, my brother had all the property, and I was kind of relieved because I could go to bed. But then when I think about how that plays out in real life, it would mean out on the street, right? So that's not so great. As a game, it works. In fact, did you know that Monopoly was invented by a woman in the early 1900s to teach us this lesson about what could happen if we just don't step up as a democracy and set the rules to keep the market open? Well, yeah, we didn't get through, did it get through? It got into the hands of Parker Brothers and sort of confirmed her theories, but anyway, so Lizzie Maggie was her name, but we've also been warned by many others about the consequences that can happen with that degree, that concentrating power. FDR, for example, spoke to Congress in 1938, and he kind of nailed it in a way. He said, the liberty of democracy is not safe if a people tolerate the growth of private power to the point that it is stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism. That was an American president. So here we then go around this circle as power inequities deepen, poverty spreads, ecological devastation continues. what happens? We become fearful, and so we feel even more. We have to go, number one, look out for number one. 60% of Harvard male graduates are now going into finance and consulting. We have to look out for ourselves. So we end up creating the very conditions that start out with, we prove them. We can then say, oh, see, human beings really are just selfish little critters, kind of elbowing each other out in the giant mall somewhere. So we confirm the premise and speed it. Does this make sense at all? I hope. Sort of? Thank you. I know it's a lot. I was very aware of what people can hold 4 to 7 points. Yeah, well, I think I'm way over that already, and I'm not nearly through with you. So where do we end up then? We end up with, no surprise, that depression in the world today is the leading cause of disability. We end up in a world where suicide takes 50% more lives than homicide, because in this belief system, this mental map, if you will, ends up creating what we most fear. So, here we are. And as was said earlier, Phil, I think, called it this pivotal moment. Well, I like to call it this moment of dissonance that we're in. You and I are an extraordinary moment to be alive. And cross-generationally, this awareness is occurring that the way we've grown up to think about reality just isn't working. And as I say that, I see the mental map cracking, and I can almost see Alan Greenspan, with the big glasses, as he was saying, oh, maybe there's a flaw in my understanding of how markets work, and I could sort of see the lines cracking in his big horn-rimmed glasses. Well, in some ways, our glasses are all cracking, right? Because the world just is not working the way that we thought it would, as so beautifully has been said already this morning. So fortunately, now the good news, fortunately, there is a new way of seeing reality that we are absorbing also, not even consciously in part, but we are nonetheless entering a new reality. And I think of it as the teachings of ecology itself. When I was a kid growing up in Texas, I never heard the word ecology. So think about what ecology is teaching us. Not that we are separate entities battling it out in competition, but actually, the core lesson of ecology is that we are creating each other and our reality moment to moment. The nature of life is a relationship of interconnection and change. That is what I think of it as an eco-mind, shifting from the separateness and limits mind of negativity and powerlessness to the eco-mind. And so physicists and biologists are giving us clues that, we are really in this connected world. And I love to quote my friend, physicist Hans-Peter Dürer, the German, who said, Frankie, in biological systems, there are no parts, there are only participants. And then another person I've learned so much from, physiologist at Oxford, Dennis Noble, who writes so beautifully, in biological systems, there are no privileged components telling the rest what to do. There is rather a form of democracy involving every element at all levels. The shape of life emerges through the interaction of all elements. That itself begins to shift us from the frame of lack to the frame of possibility. That's what ecological, thinking like an ecosystem begins to do for me. Because then we can see that human beings, just like every other species and specimen of species, we are shaped moment to moment by our connections with other people, by what we see and absorb every day. And I'm going to go into that a bit more. So, an ecological worldview opens us to a new way of seeing ourselves. And in fact, in anthropology, in neuroscience, in psychology, some have called it a revolution in understanding human nature. That's what we're reveling in today because of so much new information, also in archaeology as well, about what it means to be a human being. So we recognize, sure, we can be narrowly competitive, materialistic, and self-centered. Yes, we can be. Certainly, we've proven it. And yet, over 90% of our evolutionary time on this earth together, we've lived in tightly knit tribes where we knew our survival depended upon one another. And so my hypothesis is that we have precisely the capacities that we need in this moment, in this pivotal moment, to make the turn to life, to create the world that we want. So the human capacities we can count on, the next slide, please. Empathy. Now, empathy we can think of as a virtue to cultivate. Well, that's true. But it's also something that we cannot avoid, because we're discovering through a breakthrough in Italy in the 1990s that you and I, all of us, have neurons in our brains called mirror neurons. And so when I'm going like this, actually, there are neurons in your brain that are as if you were going like that. So we empathize with each other whether we cultivate it or not. We are shaping one another moment to moment. So think of the power that gives us. Cooperation also. They've looked at our brains at Emory University in Atlanta, and they've seen that when we cooperate, that actually it's so pleasurable that parts of our brains are stimulated, like when we eat chocolate. I love that evidence. And fairness. We knew, evolving in these tribes, that if things were unfair and rules were unfairly enforced, that the tribe would fall apart. So we have a strong sense of fairness. And in more of these studies, they find that people will go away with nothing from a deal rather than take a portion of the deal where they feel ripped off, a sense of fairness. And even capuchin monkeys will throw back their rations to their caretakers if they're getting a raw deal in their view. Fourth is our sense of efficacy, of power. Power is not a dirty word. It is just our capacity to act. And so this idea that human beings just have to have their needs met, no. We have to be co-creators, and that's why I loved it when Rebecca said, doing what's hard, that's great if we can do it together. And I love to quote Erich Fromm. Remember, my generation people, I point to my gray hair, we read Erich Fromm. Well, he taught, a very profound social philosopher who talked about the human essence being the need to make a dent. So he wanted to turn Descartes, I think therefore I am, into I am because I affect. So we have a lot to work with, including our deep need for meaning and purpose. So starting with that premise of of more than enoughness, we can go to the next slide, and we enter a very, very different world. Because we see ourselves then, yes, of course, we are these social creatures with these profoundly social capacities. And so we then see the possibility of transforming democracy from this distant and off-putting structure into a way of life, of the human values that were mentioned. Someone this morning talked about the values that we share, and I think that clearly there's evidence of values of inclusion, of fairness, and the idea of mutual accountability begin to infuse all aspects of life, from little kids in school learning how to mediate their own differences to workplaces like cooperatives, which have doubled in the last 30 years, and now there are more people who are members of cooperatives than who own shares in publicly traded companies. So we can then believe in this notion of what I call a living democracy rather than just a distant structure. Then we have confidence, and we can see that the market is a fabulous tool, but on its own, it just doesn't create a middle-class society that thrives. It needs us to step up and create the values, standards in which it operates, to keep it open and competitive and fair. So, from there, then, we can see that we have to free government from control by private wealth, and that's why the timing of this convention is so powerful with the Fair Elections Now Act, it out of committee and ready for us to support it with all of our energy. And this then creates a virtuous cycle, because then we start gaining confidence in ourselves because we actually are solving problems. And so trust grows, and it grows because we are more aligned with our own nature. Depression can begin to lift. Now, let me be super clear before I go on that this premise of living democracy is not any simple notion that human beings are good, because it's equally absolutely important to recognize that under the wrong conditions, we can look back at the terrible genocides in our history or lab experiments when we've been the guinea pigs, like the Stanford prison experiments, we don't show up too well. That we learn that under certain conditions, not a few of us, but most of us will behave brutally toward one another. That is also true, even to the point of absolute evil. So that we can hold. But the key then is clear. We can identify now with some certainty what are the conditions destined to bring out the worst in us. They are exactly what we've created. It's pretty bad news, but I'm going to continue on with the good news in a second. So can you go to the next slide then? What brings out the worst in us? You could probably add to this list. Maybe you'd like to substitute it, but I think over history we've seen that concentrated power brings no good. Lack of transparency, secrecy. For example, my favorite story from the Wall Street debacle is that while they were slicing and dicing these risky mortgages and moving them on as derivatives, the slogan among some of these Wall Street people was IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone, meaning that we're doing this in secret and we'll be out of here with our millions. So transparency, the opposite of secrecy, the lack of transparency brings out the worst in us. And then is so correctly, in my view, emphasized in the coffee party meme, the DNA of the coffee party, is that the blame game brings out the worst in us. So here we have some clarity. With this eco-mind, then, we can see, oh, yeah, we can work to dissolve these conditions, dissolve them, and to bring about their opposites. Now, I know that sounds like hard work, and Rebecca said hard work is good, but it's also, to me, a huge relief. Because think about it. Think of this. First of all, it means we don't have to transform human nature. Big relief. It hasn't worked. And this framework I'm presenting means we don't have to get rid of all the bad guys. And that's a good thing, too. Just one little statistic here. The U.S. has more people behind bars, by far, than any country in the world, and yet we have murder rates that are the worst in the industrial world and worse than many non-industrial countries. So I think that this is a huge relief, too. We don't have to get rid of the bad guys doing this to us. Okay. We can think then in terms of causation. We can let go of sort of what I think of as grabbing at random acts of sanity, protest or charity, and we can really look for what, with a laser attention, what are the entry points that are proven to move us toward what brings out the best in us. The next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Yes, the best in us. Okay, got it. So I've mentioned then that one key to beginning to the distribution of power is definitely the Fair Elections Now Act. Transparency is another key I've mentioned, and we can see efforts in the new financial legislation to make the trading of derivatives more transparent, et cetera. And in mutual accountability, we can move in so many innovative ways today in which citizens, as you know, and you're going to hear a magnificent example of it from Carolyn Lucensmeyer in America Speaks, founder of America Speaks, that we can go beyond simply voting and actually engage with one another as we've learned so much in the last 10 years or 20 years about formats like the 21st century town meetings that Carolyn holds that lead to very different outcomes because people ideas change as they reflect together. We see it as citizen assemblies and participatory budgeting, for example, the latter now in a number of countries. So then we get to, as we begin to see how we can dissolve these conditions, as we empower that spiral of empowerment, we look for what are the course changers, what are the big shifts that we can make. And so the next slide, I just mentioned 3. We let go of any magical automatic notion of a market, and we realize that a market works when we keep power and wealth distributed. And so fair taxation, here I love to quote Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote, "The subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their relative abilities." Yes. And we can support the local living economies movement, which is so dynamic and all over the world. For example, I love in Indian villages where women dairy cooperatives have created about 5 times more jobs than the high-tech industry in India. So we can support that kind of dispersed local living economies as we work for the continuing and ongoing distribution of power and make the market work. And we can move from a culture of victims and blamers to one of empowerment and mutuality. My favorite example of this is something called Youth Build. Have you heard of Youth Build? The national organization, hundreds of sites across the country, where young people who have left high school with no high school diploma, often in the poorest communities, are brought into a process where they can get their GED. They have to step up and make themselves accountable to get their GED while they're learning the building trades and actually rehabilitating homes for homeless people and others. 20,000 units of housing have been built in this way. And at the same time, they learn the arts of democracy, I call them. They learn how to run meetings, how to do fundraising, how to self-govern. So we can begin this shift then from culture of victims and blamers to empowerment and mutuality. And we can trust ourselves that we can have a politics driven by citizens' values. And that is why I believe the fair elections approach is so important. And my hero in this regard, and what has kind of lit my fire from the beginning of the idea of citizen-funded or clean elections, is the state of Maine. And I want to thank David Donnelly and many, many others who have worked and succeeded there. My hero, just to give you one symbol, a waitress in Auburn, Maine, a single mom in the year 2000, was approached by her friends, "Deb, why don't you run for office?" No way. She didn't know that they had fair elections in Maine. And all she had to do at that point was get $5 from 50 people. She said, "Oh, I'm a waitress. I think I could do that." So Deb Simpson then was able to run for office, win, be reelected. This is a woman who had a high school education. She was so outstanding as a legislator. She served on the co-chair of the Judiciary Committee for the state of Maine. And the state of Maine, because now 80% of the legislators have run with a fair elections model, they can take positions and be leaders in environmental legislation. Good for them, showing us the way. So fortunately, then, we move to, from here, we can see that with great clarity where we share common ground with others. At least we can open up a conversation. And so I just made the next slide, please. I just made a quick list of some of the areas where I think there is tremendous common ground. And that's why I was so delighted by what Phil had to say about the coffee sphere. And how, I mean, again, this list could be much longer and different, but I think that there's a deep, deep understanding that, of course, rights and responsibilities are inseparable, that it is a thriving economy that has an open and fair market, not a monopolized one, and that concentrated power leads to no good. And we typically think of conservative as focused on concentrated government power, and progressives is more concentrated on corporate power. But hey, what if we got together and just said, we're both right, if they are unaccountable? That's certainly true. And finally, that we believe in fairness. This is a deep human need, and therefore, a fair opportunities for all, I think, is a lot of common ground. So I'd like to close by just reflecting on how thrilled I am to be part of the coffee party. And this is the reason. Somebody, a dear friend of mine, said to me, Frankie, you know, our real problem is democracy itself is nobody's business. Everybody's got their issue. But who is standing up for democracy itself? And I believe that's what the coffee party means to me, that we can stand up for democracy itself, because democracy is not an instrumental value, you know, because you can use it to accomplish some issue, concern that we have, very valid they are. But rather, I see democracy as an intrinsic value. I believe that because no other profound value, for example, justice, freedom, protection of life on earth, is possible without real democracy. This is the core. So to think like an ecosystem then means rethinking power itself, and this is why I started there, and I will say a few words here as I conclude, that in fact, if we see the world through this eco lens, then we understand that because of our mirror neurons, every act we take is affecting those around us. By your very being here, others are observing that, and some of that is affecting them deeply. And that as the coffee party creates a culture that attracts people because it's a place where people feel more power, and they don't feel more fear and threat, but feel empowered. It can actually be exciting and fun, this hard work. And so there's power there. And I was tickled to see another one of these psychological experiments where they put students at the foot of a hill, 2 groups of students, and with heavy backpacks on their backs. And the only difference between these 2 groups of people is that one, they each had a friend by their side, and the other did not. And then they said, okay, how steep is that hill? And guess what? Those who had a friend by their side judged the hill to be significantly less daunting. And that is where I think the strength of this common sense of purpose that, yes, we can see this challenge of creating real democracy as less daunting as we join together. And we can then develop what I love to call, as you know, I think we're good enough. I think humans are being good enough, that we don't have to transform ourselves. We just need together to develop what I call bold humility to bring about the conditions that bring forth those strong, strong strengths that we have. And what I mean by bold humility is first rethinking fear itself. We evolved knowing that breaking from the pack was pretty scary. We'd be lost. So rethinking fear itself, because we are breaking from the pack. And it's going to bring up fear, but we can transform it. We can think of it as pure energy. And one cheesy trick I use is that when I enter into the unknown, as we are here together, and sometimes my heart pounds like this, I used to say, you wimp, and now I say, oh, inner applause. And that's the boldness part. The humility part is simply this. And this helps, getting old helps, because I look back and I think of the things that, I think of what most excites me today, right? And then I think, oh, would I have given anything a chance? Any of these things that most give me power today, would I have expected them 30 years ago? And I have to say, no, I don't think so. Like landless people and poorest people in the world developing this social movement, the largest in our hemisphere, with a reform that has allowed them to create thousands of new farms and schools, vastly reducing hunger, and succeeding because of a deep commitment to shared power and learning together, even gender shared power. No way, that's not going to happen. But it is happening in Brazil with the landless workers movement. Or I think, I grew up in Texas, and in the late 90s, utility companies, I could predict this. No. Utility companies would bring citizens together in what is called deliberative poll. They discuss energy options together. 60% of the people in the process would agree to increase what they pay if moving toward renewable energy. And out of that process, the utilities listened. And so a decade later, wind farm investment led by Texas made the U.S. the world's biggest generator of wind power. Would I have predicted that? In Texas? No. I thought it was all about oil in Texas when I was there. No, I was wrong. I was wrong. And what about a small, poor country, the most deforested in Latin America in speed of deforestation, turning itself around, foresting now half of its land, and moving to 95% renewable energy? And this country, known as a stable democracy, and now have a code passed last year clearly barring corporations from campaign contributions. Would I have thought that was going to happen? And you know what country I'm talking about? Costa Rica. It happened. It's happening. Costa Rica. So we come then with this eco-mind, and we see power as what we create moment to moment. That is simply then the lesson, the humility here, is recognizing if we understand reality that way, then what? It's simply not possible to know what's possible. It's not possible to know what's possible. And if that's true, we're free, right? We can just go for this world we really want because it may actually be possible. So that's why we can together imagine and create democracy worthy of the best in us. And that's why I am proud to be with you on this journey in this moment in human drama. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.